This evening we will be covering both Genesis chapter 48 and Genesis 49. For one, Genesis 48 is only 22 verses, and I felt like that would make a pretty short sermon. But also in content there are similar themes between the two chapters. They seem to be dealing with much the same thing, and so I thought that they would be good grouped together. So we will be starting Genesis 48 as a reminder of where we are in the story of Jacob and Joseph. Joseph, of course, has revealed himself to his brothers, and Jacob now knows that he is alive. And what we last studied is that Jacob and his family have all moved down to Egypt, and they've worked things out with Pharaoh so that they are given the land of Goshen and are perhaps shepherds for Pharaoh, and everything is working out as is planned. Jacob is nearing the end of his life, and what we will see in these chapters are Jacob's end of his life. But before his life ends, he has just a couple things to deal with, and that is what we will be talking about this evening. So I'd invite you, if you have not already, turn in your Bibles to Genesis 48 and read with me starting in verse 1. Now it came about after these things that Joseph was told, "Behold, your father is sick." So he took his two sons Manasseh and Ephraim with him. When it was told to Jacob, "Behold, your son Joseph has come to you," Israel collected his strength and sat up in the bed. Then Jacob said to Joseph, "God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me. And he said to me, Behold, I will make you fruitful and numerous, and I will make you a company of people, and will give this land to your descendants after you for an everlasting possession. Now your two sons, who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are. But your offspring that have been born after them shall be yours. They shall be called by the names of their brothers and their inheritance. Now as for me, when I came from Paddan, Rachel died, to my sorrow, in the land of Canaan on the journey, when there was still some distance to go to Ephrath, and I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is, Bethlehem." So Jacob is reaching his last days, and he is aware of this. And so he calls Joseph to him, and Joseph brings his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and they go see him. And Jacob explains to Joseph that he has been blessed by God, but then Jacob claims Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, as his own. And what he is doing here is he is putting them in with the inheritance that he is going to give to all of his other sons. They will receive a portion of that. And so he has laid claim to them. Joseph's other sons that he bore would be part of Joseph's inheritance, but Ephraim and Manasseh are part of Jacob's inheritance. Now one thing that we see here is he talks about, "Now as for me, when I came from Paddan, Rachel died to my sorrow." And at first glance, this kind of seems as a out of left field kind of comment. What does this have to do with the rest of what Jacob is saying? I read a commentary, and I tend to agree with this commentator, that what Jacob is doing is saying, since Rachel died giving birth to Benjamin, it is fitting that I take your two sons, Joseph, and add them in with the inheritance instead of what Rachel could have bore if she continued to live. That seems to be a logical reason why Jacob would be mentioning that at this juncture. Keep reading with me in verse 8. When Israel saw Joseph's sons, he said, "Who are these?" Joseph said to his father, "They are my sons, whom God has given me here." So he said, "Bring them to me, please, that I may bless them." Now the eyes of Israel were so dim from age that he could not see. Then Joseph brought them close to him, and he kissed them and embraced them. Israel said to Joseph, I never expected to see your face, and behold, God has let me see your children as well. Then Joseph took them from his knees and bowed with his face to the ground. Joseph took them both, Ephraim with his right hand toward Israel's left, and Manasseh with his left hand toward Israel's right, and brought them close to him. But Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, crossing his hands, although Manasseh was the firstborn. He blessed Joseph and said, the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God whom has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads, and may my name live on in them, and the names of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and may they grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. When Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on Ephraim's head, it displeased him, and he grasped his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. Joseph said to his father, not so, my father, for this one is the firstborn. Place your right hand on his head. But his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know. He also will become a people, and he also will be great. However, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations. He blessed them that day, saying, by you Israel will pronounce blessing, saying, may God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. Then Israel said to, thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh. Then Israel said to Joseph, behold, I am about to die, but God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your fathers. I will give you one portion more than your brothers, which I took from the hand of the Amorite with my sword and my bow. So the first thing that we want to take note of in this passage is when Jacob says to Joseph, I never expected to see your face. He thought Joseph was dead. And yet here this blessing has come upon him in his old age that yes, Joseph is alive, Joseph is governor of Egypt, but also he gets to see Joseph's children. And that is a thing that is very dear to him and that he relishes. He takes Ephraim and Manasseh and Joseph puts them in the order that he thinks that they should be in. That Manasseh will be on the right hand. The right hand is the hand of prominence. And then Ephraim on the left, the lesser hand. But then Jacob takes his hands and he crosses them and places his right hand on Ephraim and his left hand on Manasseh. I realize y'all are seeing that in reverse, but this is my right hand. And he pronounces his blessing. And Joseph says, no, that's not right. I realize that you can't see. No, this is Manasseh. He's the oldest. He's the one that should get the blessing. But Jacob says, no, that's not going to be the case. That Ephraim would be the greater of the two. And at first glance, you might think, oh, this is Jacob being typical Jacob. He like he did with Esau, he is usurping and kind of mixing things up. But what we have to realize is that it was prophesied of Jacob before he even came out of the womb that the older should serve the younger. And that was God's will. It was God's will that Isaac would be the son of promise rather than Ishmael. And what we are seeing is a pattern that is playing out over and over in Israel's history, that the older is going to serve the younger, and the younger is going to be the greater of the two. And based on what I'm reading and what I see in chapter 49 as well, this is not just Jacob going rogue, but rather this is God's will. And so he blesses Ephraim and says that he will be greater. And when we look throughout the history of Israel, this does, in fact, become the case. Initially, as they come out of Egypt, it is Manasseh that is the greater tribe. But as the history of Israel goes on, it is Ephraim that rules, and Ephraim who eventually becomes the head of the northern part, the northern kingdom of Israel. And so they become a ruling tribe among their brethren. Also, we want to note that it says that God will be with them. Jacob proclaims that, look, I'm going to die, but God is going to be with you. God is going to be with my children. And eventually you're going to be brought back. Again, this is something that's said over and over. It's something that God seems to have made known to Jacob. And he makes that proclamation, but he also says, I give you, in my translation it says, one portion more than your brothers. That phrase is difficult to translate. I believe in the ESV it says one mountain hill or something like that. And even some translations would say, I give you Shechem over your brothers. This word can be translated as Shechem, but it also is the word for mountain or hill. But you'll see that it's been translated portion here. And I tend to agree with that's what the gist of what Jacob is saying. That he is giving him a double portion over his brothers because both Ephraim and Manasseh would be blessed. But it is a difficult phrase to translate, and so if your translation says something different than mine, keep that in mind. Now let's turn our attention to Genesis 49, starting in verse 1. Then Jacob summoned his sons and said, Assemble yourselves that I may tell you what will befall you in the days to come. Gather together and hear, O sons of Jacob, and listen to Israel your father. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might in the beginning of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. Uncontrolled as water, you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it. He went up to my couch. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Their swords are implements of violence. Let my soul not enter into their counsel. Let not my glory be united with their assembly, because in their anger they slew men, and in their self-will they lamed oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will disperse them in Jacob, and scatter them in Israel. So Jacob brings his sons. He knows that the end of his life is near, and he is now bringing his sons in to bless them. It's written in poetry style that is marked in some people's fonts in their Bibles. On the PowerPoint screen, I've taken it out of that poetry style simply because it would not fit. So that's why it's not like that. But it is in the style of writing that you would typically see in the poetry books of the Bible. And this poem is sometimes called The Blessing of Jacob, and that's a little bit of a misnomer. Because, yes, Jacob does bless some of his sons, but not all of them. The first three sons, he does not bless, but even in verse 7, to Simeon and Levi, he says that they are cursed. And so we will deal with these as we go along and see which ones are blessed and which ones are cursed. He tells them what will befall them in the days to come. That's what all this blessing and cursing is about. And again, I don't think that this is Jacob's whim. It does not seem to be Jacob's whim because all of this came true. My inclination is to believe that this is God's will. Now, how did Jacob know God's will? Did God tell him in a conversation that is not recorded? That's possible. Is this a situation where Jacob is inspired and is a prophet of God, that's not out of the realm of possibility, but the text just does not say. I would posit, though, that Jacob is telling God's will here, not just his own personal whims. He begins by addressing Reuben, his firstborn, and he'll go in order of birth. He says, Reuben, you are my firstborn, but you shall not have preeminence. Reuben is not going to have the blessing that is typically given to the oldest son. He's not going to have preeminence. Why? Because he went and slept with his father's concubine, his mother's maidservant. And so that is why he is not given preeminence. He then turns his attention to Simeon and Levi, and he pairs them together. This is the only pairing that I see in the text. He deals with them together. He says they are brothers, but you might also translate this phrase or this word as they're two of a kind. They are the same. He talks about that they were violent and they, in their anger, slew men, and that's talking about the massacre of the men at Shechem because of what happened to Dinah. And he says, because of that, because of what they did, he says, I will disperse them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. They did not have a portion inheritance in Israel. Now, Reuben, it is not said of him this way. Reuben did have a portion of the land in Israel. But what we see in the history of Israel is this is exactly what happened. The Levites, yes, they did get to serve before God because of later things that happened among the tribe of Levi, but they did not have land as their own inheritance. They were apportioned certain cities, but not a whole territory of land. And then Simeon, if you were to ever look at a map of the 12 tribes, you'll see Simeon surrounded by Judah, because they really lived in Judah's land, the land apportioned to Judah. And so neither of these had their portion in the blessings of Jacob. They were scattered among Jacob's people. Let's keep reading in verse 8. He says, Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons shall bow down to you. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He couches, he lies down as a lion, and as a lion, who dares rouse him up? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the people. He ties his foal to the vine, and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. He washes his garments in wine, and his robes in the blood of grapes. His eyes are dull from wine, and his teeth white from milk. Zebulun will dwell at the seashore, and he shall be a haven for ships, and his flank shall be toward Sidon. Issachar is a strong donkey, lying down between the sheepfolds. When he saw that a resting place was good, and that the land was pleasant, he bowed his shoulder to bear burdens, and became a slave at forced labor. Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a horned snake in the path that bites the horse's heels, so that his rider falls backwards. For your salvation I wait, O Lord. So let's talk about what he says about Judah first. The inheritance of the oldest did not fall to Reuben. It did not fall to Simeon. Did not fall to Levi. The next would be Judah. And it's clearly stated that Judah, your brothers shall praise you. The scepter shall not depart from Judah. Judah was considered to be the ruling class in Israel. And it took a while in Israel's history for that to happen, but eventually it did, starting with David, and through Solomon, Rehoboam all the way through the line of the kings of Judah. But it said, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. The word Shiloh means heavenly peace. And it is not a phrase that is typically attributed to Jesus. As far as I know, this is the only passage that uses this particular word or phrase to talk about Jesus. But I don't see a way to think of this as anybody other than Jesus, or anything other than Jesus, as some have tried to do, but there is no clear answers from which they're coming. Well, what does it say about this Shiloh? That to him the obedience of the peoples would be, and that also that he had the image of royalty, that he ties his foal to the vine and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. But also something that marks this Shiloh coming is abundance. It says that he washes his garments in wine and his robes in the blood of grapes, and that his eyes are dull from wine and his teeth white from meal. There's going to be so much wine. Wine would be a sign of luxury, a sign of good things, especially anything from the grapes was considered something of wealth and abundance. And that would be a sign of this Shiloh to come, that there would be great things in abundance for the people. When I preached or taught class on Jesus turning water into wine, I reference this verse because I think it harkens back to this verse. Him turning water to wine. He showed the abundance of wine that would happen during the Messianic age. That was a sign of the Messianic age, and he fulfilled it. But of course, he pointed to spiritual things from that. Another thing I want to notice, I'm not going to go through every single son's portion, but I do want to notice throughout these blessings that there are many allusions to animals throughout this. That it is a prominent feature of what is going on here. Even when we were talking about Simeon and Levi in verse 5, it says, in their self-will they lamed oxen. And it talks about Reuben, that he's uncontrolled as water. But we start to really see the animal allusions starting with Judah. He is a lion's whelp, and as a lion, who dares rouse him up? But then, when we come to Issachar is a strong donkey. He says that Dan is a serpent, a horned snake. And as we go along, we will see more animals being used. And so I do want to pay attention to that detail because it is prevalent throughout the text. And then we have verse 18, which again seems to be kind of out of place, out of nowhere, so to speak. He says, for your salvation I wait, O Lord. And by the way, you'll see that Lord is capitalized. That is the term Yahweh, the Lord's name being used there. It's not a generic term like Elohim or something like that. For your salvation I wait, O Yahweh. Why does Jacob say that in the middle of his blessings of his children? Well, as you have looked through it, there's a lot of negative and not a lot of positive. Reuben, he had something negative to say. Simeon, something negative. Levi, something negative. Positive about Judah. You could say positive or neutral about Zebulun. But then Issachar is going to be a slave at forced labor. And then we also have Dan, who is called a serpent, a horned snake in the path. And as we know the history of the tribe of Dan, they were one of the preeminent tribes at leading the people astray into idolatry. And so they were a snake, but not in a good way at all. And so I wonder if Jacob is saying this about all of his children and revealing God's will and realizing that these things aren't good and that God is going to have to save them and bail them out, which of course he did. That seems to be the reason for what he says in verse 18. Keep reading with me in verse 19. As for Gad, raiders shall raid him, but he will raid at their heels. As for Asher, his food shall be rich, and he will yield royal dainties. Naphtali is a doe let loose. He gives beautiful words. Joseph is a fruitful bough by a spring. Its branches run over a wall. The archers bitterly attacked him and shot at him and harassed him. But his bow remained firm, and his arms were agile from the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. For there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. From the God of your father who helps you, and by the Almighty who blesses you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that lies beneath, blessings of the breast and of the womb. The blessings of your father have surpassed the blessings of my ancestors. Up to the utmost bound of the everlasting hills, may they be on the head of Joseph, and on the crown of the head of the one distinguished among his brothers. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. In the morning he devours the prey, and in the evening he divides the spoil. We'll stop there for just a moment. Now, one thing I want you to notice that I haven't highlighted on the screen, but notice the animal illusions that we were talking about a moment ago. Naphtali is a doe. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. But then we come to Joseph's blessing. And Joseph's blessing is kind of notoriously difficult to translate. And honestly, I don't know a ton about Hebrew, not enough to really offer an educated opinion about these things. But when it talks about Joseph being a fruitful bough, it is suggested by some that the word bough and the idea of branches is not really the right figure to be using. That actually this is talking about colts and donkeys that are coming forth from Joseph. And yes, that would fit the animal allusions that permeate throughout this chapter, but again, there is difficulty in translating it this way that may be beyond me. Another thing that is difficult to translate, it talks about the archers attacking him, but then it says his bow remained firm. That pronoun his is in the singular, but it is a feature of Hebrew grammar that the singular pronoun can be used to talk about collectives. In this case, the collective would be the archers. And when it talks about his arms were agile, some other translations of that would say that his arms were weakened. And so there's a little bit of difficulty in understanding what exactly precisely is being said here. But I don't think there is difficulty in understanding the gist of what Jacob is saying. That Joseph is fruitful and that he will be blessed, and that even his enemies, as they shoot at him and harass him, he is going to be delivered by the mighty one of Jacob, the shepherd, the stone of Israel. We saw this in chapter 48 that Jacob referred to God as a shepherd, but we see this allusion again that he refers to God as a shepherd. I do find that interesting because, as we learned in the last chapter, these men were shepherds, and so this is a term that they would understand. But as a shepherd, I think it is an appropriate illustration or figure to use of God, specifically right now, because the pasture of Jacob has moved down to Egypt. That is, his children and grandchildren have moved down to Egypt, and God is going to lead them out as a shepherd leads the sheep. Jacob makes a bold claim when he says, "The blessings of your father," that is Jacob, "have surpassed the blessings of my ancestors." It's a bold claim because what God blessed Abraham and Isaac with was a lie. And yet I think we can say that this is true, that Jacob was blessed even more, and that God was with him. Let's close out chapter 49 by starting in verse 28. All these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is what their father said to them when he blessed them. He blessed them every one with the blessing appropriate to him. Then he charged them and said to them, "I am about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, and in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, which is before Mamre in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought along with the field from Ephron the Hittite for a burial site. There they buried Abraham and his wife Sarah, and there they buried Isaac and his wife Rebekah, and there I buried Leah. The field and the cave that is in it, purchased from the sons of Heth." When Jacob finished charging his sons, he drew his feet into the bed and breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. So, it says that all these are the 12 tribes of Israel. This is what their father said to them when he blessed them. And it does say he blessed them, everyone with the blessing appropriate to him. I said that the title, "The Blessings of Jacob," was a bit of a misnomer, but I don't think it's a full misnomer. He did bless his children according to the blessing appropriate to him. And sometimes that was no blessing at all, that was a curse. But I want to note again Jacob's faith. It has stayed steadfast throughout his entire life, and even at his death, he is making instruction about what is to come, knowing what God has told him and only what God has told him. He is down there in the land of Egypt, but God has told him, as he said in chapter 48, God has told him that he is going to take that people back out. And he wants to be buried in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, because that's in the land of promise. Abraham and Sarah were buried there, Isaac and Rebekah, and he buried Leah there. He wants to be buried as well, because that's where their portion will be. And so Jacob's faith remains steadfast. And he finished charging his sons. He drew his feet into the bed and breathed his last, and he was gathered to his people. Thus ends the life of Jacob. Thus ends the accounting of his life. And that also ends our chapter for tonight. So what can we take from all of this? Many lessons. You could talk about you get what you deserve. That here the children seemingly somewhat got away with things during their life, but as Jacob is settling the accounts as he's about to die, he blesses them according to what they have done. According to what Reuben did, he was not given preeminence. According to what Simeon and Levi did, they did not have a portion. And so we could talk about actions and consequences. We could continue to talk about the faith of Jacob. But I want to talk about Jesus. Because in Genesis 49, we get one of the prophecies that lead us to Jesus and the coming of the Messiah. And what is emphasized about Jesus in this passage is his rulership. That to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Peter on the day of Pentecost pointed to a descendant of David pointing at scriptures and saying that it was promised that someone would be seated on the throne of David, a descendant of his would be given that kingdom. And he made the connection that it was Jesus, that Jesus was the Messiah. Jesus is Shiloh. He is the one who reigns forever and ever. In that way, the scepter does not depart from Judah, because it does not depart from Jesus. And when we think about Jesus' lordship in our own lives, to Him should be our obedience. That is what should dominate every facet of our lives. Every waking moment is making sure that we are in obedience to Jesus Christ. Seeing to it that we're doing the things that He has told us to do. And that's why we're here. On the first day of the week, we come together to do the things that Jesus has taught us to do through His Word and through His disciples. And we come to reflect on our salvation, reflect on our lives to make sure that we are in proper step with Him. And in a moment we will sing the invitation song that is designed to get you to think about where your life stands with Jesus. Is your obedience truly to Him? If you have not obeyed the gospel, this is a time to do so while we reflect on this song. If you are a Christian and have not been living in obedience to Jesus, this is a time to make things right. And so in this time of reflection, if you need to make changes in your life, won't you come while we stand and sing?